Yes, I think we're live now. Yes, we're live. I'm seeing myself in Zoom.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stefano. Let's kick off.
Well, yes. Sorry for the slight delay, a few minutes. never.
No worries. I will make up for them. I will make up for them in the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us in the panel on AI for Good. My name is Nathalie Bertels. I'm a senior researcher and valorization manager at CITIP, IMEC KU Leuven, and co-chair of the BDVA Task Force 5 on policy and societal issues. And together with Stefano Modaferri, a senior researcher at the University of Southampton and co-chair of the BDVA Task Force 8 on business models, we will be your moderators for this session today. We will be exploring in this panel the use of data and AI for the benefit of society. And unfortunately, the very present COVID-19 pandemic will be used as an example to explore these practical dimensions and challenges of finding a balance between, on the one hand, the urgent need to implement AI technologies in critical sectors, such as healthcare, transport, logistics, manufacturing, and on the other hand, maintaining the necessary levels of protection of human rights and corporate interest, protection of corporate interest. So this tension we will be exploring, and this is an important discussion. And we would like to invite all of you to participate in this discussion. And you can participate in this discussion today, right now. So I'm showing the housekeeping rules for this session. So please use the chat in Whova to ask your questions. So the chat in Zoom is not activated. We will allow for enough time to have the panelists respond and react to your questions. Please also join us later on, share on Twitter, get involved in the activities of the PPP and the upcoming public consultations and investment programs on the topic. We have a very busy program for the panel, and I would like to first introduce all of the speakers very briefly. So it's with great pleasure that we have in the panel today Nuria Oliver. She is a co-founder and vice president of ELIS, the European Laboratory for Learning and Intelligent Systems, and chief data scientist at DataPop Alliance. So since March 2020, she has been appointed commissioner for the president of the Valencian region on AI strategy and data science applied to the fight against COVID-19. So she's leading a team of over 20 data scientists who work on large-scale modeling to answer public policy questions. And as part of this work, she has launched a COVID-19 impact survey, one of the largest anonymous citizen surveys to data related to COVID-19. So after Nuria's intervention, we will have an intervention from Professor Paul Lukovic. He is a scientific director and head of the research unit Embedded Intelligence at the TU Kaiserslautern and the FKI. His research focuses on cyber-physical systems, pervasive computing, and social interactive systems, and he is the coordinator of the Humane AI project. In this project, research is conducted on how computers can understand social reality, social systems, with the aim of developing AI in future that interacts with humans so that people could accept AI as a partner. And I think this human-machine or human-AI interaction and trust, they're very important components in the discussion today, and we very much look forward to hearing more on this. Next, we have Dr. Clara Neppel, who is Senior Director at IEEE, responsible for the growth of IEEE's operations and presence in Europe, and serving as a point of contact for initiatives that help implementing IEEE's global commitment to fostering technological innovation for the benefit of humanity. And it's this benefit of humanity, AI for Good, that is central in the panel today. We also have in our presence today, Gabriela Catano. Gabriela is Associate Vice President of IDC, a research and consulting expert firm that is doing market research on ICT trends and scenarios. And as our last speaker, we have Gash Bular. Gash, thank you for allowing us in the panel today also to leverage on your over 30 years of industry experience in control systems within manufacturing related industries. He is the director of the Digital Manufacturing Innovation Hub in Wales and CEO of the European Factory Foundation, Association of Research and Industry Organizations from manufacturing, logistics, and ICT sectors. So this is the impressive lineup of speakers we have for all of you today. Please interact, please share. In the WUVA, we also have the opportunity and the facilities to have you upload different documents, to be interactive in many different ways. So please do so. I think what we asked our panelists was to share, based on their expertise, how they see the impact of this tension we mentioned, so the tension between the urgent need to actually implement AI technologies for the good of society and the necessary protection of human rights and corporate interest. This tension, this balance, how do you perceive this in your research, or how do you perceive this in business? So I would first like to ask Nuria to take the floor and to give us her contribution on this. Thank you so much and enjoy the panel. Nuria, you have the floor.
Thank you, Natalie. I think you need to stop sharing so I can share.
I will.
That's what Zoom is telling me. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to this really relevant and interesting panel. So before we enter into the subject matter of AI for social good, I think we need to really understand, first of all, the huge challenges that we face as a species, which I'm sure we won't be able to tackle without the help of AI. AI is not going to be the solution, but it definitely needs to be part of the solution, and also the technology world that we live in. So some of the challenges that are particularly relevant for Europe, we live in an aging world. Europe is one of the most aged regions in the world. We don't have a pyramid, anymore. We have more like a rectangle turning into an inverted pyramid soon. The aging of the population presents a lot of challenges, including healthcare related challenges with the prevalence of chronic disease. We live in a world with limited resources that are actually not enough if we continue consuming at the rate that we are consuming, but also they are not evenly allocated. In the 21st century, we are witnessing a polarization in the accumulation of wealth. The 100 richest people in the world own more than the 4,000 poorest people in the world. We live in a world of climate change where the average Earth temperatures are rising. In consequence, the average sea levels are rising, and the intensity and frequency of natural disasters is also increasing. And of course, we live in a world of global pandemics, as we are facing right now. But from a technological perspective, we live in an era of excitement and opportunity, which has been sort of like summarized as being the fourth industrial revolution. And as any other industrial revolution, it is profoundly transforming the societies that we live in. Disciplines such as nanotechnology, biotechnology, genetic engineering, and of course, AI are at the core of this fourth industrial revolution. And why is AI at the core of this revolution? In fact, the role that AI is playing in this revolution has been parallels, has been established a parallelism between AI in the fourth industrial revolution and electricity in the second industrial revolution. Why? Because AI is transversal, is invisible, is software, and is ubiquitous. It's a discipline that you can apply to any area, from manufacturing to transportation to healthcare to education to commerce to climate sciences to biology and so forth. Moreover, it's scalable. It is complex, but it enables us to tackle the complexity. In fact, we are only able to solve really complex problems, thanks to the help of AI, and because its software is updatable. And it also has a very strong property. It not only enables us to explain the past or interpret the present, but also to predict the future. But of course, not everything is positive with AI. It also presents us with a number of challenges and limitations that we do need to tackle if we want to make sure that this discipline will actually have positive societal impact. Some of those limitations include the computational violations of privacy, algorithmic discrimination and bias, algorithmic opacity or the lack of transparency of a lot of AI algorithms, the subliminal manipulation of behavior that we are all subject to if we use services that are recommending, any kind of content, the lack of veracity using AI techniques. We can generate what is called deep fakes, synthetic videos, audios, text, images that are indistinguishable from real content, excessive carbon footprint for the technology sector in general, but for the AI also, discipline in particular, because the deep neural networks that are needed to and that are present in most of today's AI-based systems require huge amounts of data and huge amounts of computation to be trained. We also have the challenge of lack of diversity, both in the field. There is a worrying 10–15% of female presence in the AI field and also in the technology sector in general, but also the algorithms lack diversity, leading to what is called the echo chambers, in such a way that we tend to be exposed to content that is sort of like with high likelihood is the content that we are going to like, and not so much the content that is different from us. It also generates situations of asymmetry with respect to who has the data that is necessary to train a lot of these systems, but more importantly, who has the capabilities and the talent to be able to do something useful with that data. And right now, Europe is in a position of weakness when compared to North America and Asia. There is also the challenge of reproducibility, because a lot of these systems are based on being trained with proprietary data. So it's very difficult to really reproduce and retrain systems that have been trained with proprietary data. And of course, because it's software, it's hackable. So it's not invulnerable to both more traditional hacking, but also to being fooled by other AI algorithms that have been trained to fool existing AI algorithms. Nonetheless, the presence of AI in our lives is ubiquitous. AI algorithms determine, which news we read, which friends, we befriend, which books we read, which movies we watch, which music we listen to. We can talk to our phones. We can talk to our speakers. They don't have a keyboard. They don't have a screen. We talk to them and they can understand what we are saying. Increasingly so, the routing algorithms in maps are using AI to predict, for example, traffic and determine how to route ourselves. It's been decades that the stock transactions are algorithmic already. Of course, we have massive processes of automatization in the manufacturing sector. We have autonomous cars. As I said, the science is sort of like progress in science depends a lot on progress in AI, because at the end of the day, we have massive amounts of non-structured data in science that we can only really make sense of and analyze using AI algorithms. But also increasingly, AI algorithms are going to be helping doctors determine our diagnosis or our treatment, including COVID-19. And increasingly so also, algorithms are going to be suggesting our judges what judicial sentence we should deserve. And because of the penetration of AI in these consequential areas for human lives, AI has become a political issue. As this slide illustrates, this shows the number of times the UK Parliament and in the US Congress that the term machine learning and AI has been named. And as we see, it's as if AI didn't exist until a few years ago, even though the discipline formally exists since the 1950s. And therefore, it's no surprise that since 2017, right now, I think it's around 50 countries in the world have drafted their AI strategies to make sure that AI will actually have positive societal impact, and that the limitations that I mentioned at the beginning are actually tackled in such a way that we are not perpetuating, existing, for example, gaps in society because of AI, but we're actually helping to reduce them. There is also supranational strategies like in the European Commission. And there are countries like the UK that have established a number of government bodies in the country to ensure an ethical use of AI and to promote the use of AI. And there's also another interesting phenomenon that has happened, which is countries like Spain that doesn't have a national strategy yet is seeing regions drafting their own regional strategies like Catalonia and the Valencian region. From my perspective, any strategy has to include a clear path in these 5 dimensions. First, of course, the technological dimension. AI is a discipline, within computer science and engineering, but also the legal and regulatory frameworks that would be needed for a society that is actively using AI, the ethical dimension, the people, society, and education dimension, and the economy and labor dimension. And in my talk right now, I'm only going to focus on one little slice of the people and society and education dimension, because that's we have the tremendous opportunity to leverage AI to really tackle all of these challenges that I talked at the beginning. And this movement actually, I think it started on a more global scale, probably when the new Sustainable Development Goals were about to be defined in 2015, and Secretary General of the United Nations called for a data revolution, and they commissioned a report called the Data Revolution Report to a number of experts, including my PhD advisor, Professor Sandy Penland. So as the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were developed, there's been a world movement in understanding the intersection between data and AI and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from 2 perspectives. The first one is from the perspective of using data and these data being analyzed with sophisticated algorithms to enable us to better assess how close are we to achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the second line of work is actually targeted towards helping us achieve those goals faster, thanks to the existence of data and AI. In my experience, I've used a lot of large-scale mobile data captured by the mobile network infrastructure, analyzed using AI algorithms, and we have seen the value that it brings in a number of areas, including how to better understand the impact of natural disasters, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is one of the consequences of climate change, to understand the economic development of regions and promote financial inclusion, to understand the behavior of cities, to do lots of projects on modeling transportation flows for public health, and particularly for pandemics, as we are facing right now, energy prediction, population studies. There is a world movement in creating censuses through novel data sources to be able to do them in a much more efficient and also almost sort of like real time or a much faster way that has been done so far. And there are even works in using data and AI for agriculture. And because of the situation that we are right now with the pandemic, I wanted to quickly share with you the focus of using AI in the context of COVID-19, which is also framed within the ELIS unit that I just created in Alicante. Basically, I had worked on this topic for many years, since 2009. And when the pandemic took place, I offered the government in the Valencian region of Spain to create a team of experts working on how to use data and AI to help make better public policies. I got a very positive response from the government. They named me commissioner for the president on AI and COVID-19, which is an honorary position. We are all volunteers doing this work altruistically. And basically, our goal is to fill this gap. On the one hand, we have many different data sources that are valuable because they are a reflection of reality. And on the other hand, we have policymakers who are trying to make decisions that are based on evidence and not so much based on intuitions or obsolete knowledge. And the challenge is how you fill this gap. It's not a trivial thing to do. So what we've set up in our team is 4 lines of work. First, we've been able to analyze large-scale anonymized data derived from the mobile network infrastructure in a, I guess, unprecedented project where the 3 largest telcos in Spain share the data with the National Office of Statistics. And of course, mobility, human mobility is very important in the context of a pandemic. And through the analysis of the data, we've been able to measure human mobility and determine the impact of the different confinement measures. The second line of work are epidemiological models, computational epidemiological models that enable us to predict how the pandemic is going to evolve, not only under the current conditions, but also under different potential scenarios. For example, different scenarios of mobility or different scenarios of contact tracing. The third team is working on predictive models of hospitalizations, intensive care units, but also, for example, we infer prevalence of the disease back in April when there were no tests, and that was a very important question to answer, how many people are really infected. And the last line of work, as Natalie mentioned, is this really large-scale citizen survey with over 380,000 answers worldwide called COVID-19 Impact Survey that has really enabled us throughout all these 31 weeks that we've been running it to understand the situation and the perception of people during the pandemic. But even if the result of this is still too technical. So one of the key elements, I think, for the success of our team is having a member from the government, a director general working for the president, being a very active member of the team, working with me on prioritizing the work, interpreting the results, and creating actionable sort of like knowledge that could be useful for policy making. And this is not a trivial thing to do. We capture some of the difficulties and opportunities in these two reports. This is the business to government data sharing for the public interest report by the high-level expert group in the European Commission that I belong to. And this is a paper that we wrote, a number of experts worldwide, on the power and the possibilities, but also the difficulties on using mobile data to help in the context of the pandemic. And there are many challenges, and that's why we don't see these efforts being more widespread. We have capacity challenges. We have a lack of digital mindset in a lot of governments and public authorities. We have a lot of difficulties in terms of accessing the data, including, of course, privacy and data protection concerns, but those are not, I would say, the biggest ones, because a lot of the data is fully aggregated and anonymized. There is a huge gap between where science is and where the real world is, and how to close that gap is not trivial. And in the context of a pandemic, there's also been a lot of challenges because of the lack of preparedness for immediate action. You have to be making decisions every day. But I've also learned that, a public health problem is not a healthcare problem. It is a societal challenge. And because of that, we need to have a holistic approach, which I have been missing, to be honest, in most of the actions in most of the countries. And from my perspective, we need to reach a virtuous cycle between these three elements. On the one hand, high quality data that is captured and shared in a systematic manner. Data that enables us to understand where we are, how we got where we got, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and so forth. The second pillar are people and technology, the necessary human resources, but also human resources with the right skills and capabilities, technology and data to be able to do a good job. And finally, the idea is that the result of all this work actually informs public policies that tackle specific weaknesses in the system. For example, in Spain, we know that around 50% of the people cannot self-isolate. So let's design programs to help people self-isolate, tackling the different reasons why they say they cannot self-isolate, from sharing the home to not being able to not work to psychologically finding it very difficult. And just to finalize, I wanted to share with you 6 main recommendations that we captured in this paper that is actually just published this week, and that we think could help leverage data and technology for positive societal impact, and that the COVID-19 pandemic offers us an important opportunity. The first recommendation is that we need to think and act boldly and now. We do have an opportunity, but we can't just talk about it. We actually have to act. The second important concept is that we should only deploy data and technology that are fit for purpose. We should have clarity on what the purpose is and then apply them only for that purpose. We should always place people and the planet at the center. We should invest very heavily in data literate human and data systems. This has been a huge challenge that I live every day in my position as commissioner. We need to also think about how to define sustainable business models, because a lot of the valuable data is proprietary data, and we need to figure out how to make it accessible in a way that is financially sustainable. And we also really need to seriously think about regulation as an enabler. If we know where we want to go, what regulation is needed to help us go where we want to go. And from my perspective, where I think we want to go is to a world where we improve the quality of life of everyone on the planet and the planet itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nuria. Thank you very much for perfectly setting this scene, for showing this complexity, for explaining your views on the need for this holistic approach. I would like to invite all the participants to the session to prepare your questions and for Nuria and to put them into the chat. So don't wait until the end. Nuria cannot join us until the end of the session. So please, yes, voice your questions to Nuria in the chat right away. So maybe Nuria, I would like to ask you already one follow-up question, maybe coming back to the COVID-19 impact survey that you mentioned. In the impact survey, do you see elements of this tension that we put in the focus of the panel? Like, do people have trust issues with the implementation or the quick implementation of technology? Do you see that they respond to this in a way that could make it even more clear for us to research further on this?
And that's a good question. We do see, we don't have a specific question on whether people trust technology or trust data, but we do know how many people report having installed the contact tracing app in their country, for example. We do have a question on whether people think that the measures adopted by the government are enough or not, and so forth. And we do observe significant cultural differences. There are 3 countries that we are studying right now very intensively: Spain, Italy, and Germany. And we do observe very significant differences in some of the behaviors, particularly between Germany and the rest. Something that is very surprising to us, we have a question where we ask people if they got tested for COVID-19, and you have different options to answer, like, yes, I'm positive, yes, I'm negative, yes, I was positive, yes, I was negative, I'm waiting for results, no, I don't want to get tested, no, I don't think I need to get tested. And a very small percentage of respondents in Italy and in Spain say that they don't want to get tested. However, a much larger percentage of the Germans say that they don't want to get tested, which could be a reflection of a lack of maybe some concerns on not wanting the government to know whether they have the disease or not, but also I think a reflection on the burden that it entails if you are positive. If you are positive, you have to put yourself in quarantine. We do know from the survey, as I mentioned in my talk, that roughly 50% of the people say that they would not be able to self-isolate. The number one reason is for sharing the home, but there is other reasons. For example, among the youth, the most important reason after sharing the home are psychological reasons. 19% or 18% report fear of stigmatization. And another thing is 16% report that psychologically they would not be able to isolate themselves. Are we doing anything to tackle these challenges that people are facing? That's something that I'm not sure we are doing. And in terms of the government, we've also seen changes in the perception of the measures as the pandemic has evolved. So, for example, in Spain, until the end of June, we had different phases of confinement until the end of June. And then at the end of June, the country did the deconfinement and we reached the new normality. So until the end of June, roughly 40% of the people say they wanted more measures, and roughly 40% of the people said that the measures were enough. And it was quite balanced. And then exactly when the new normality took place, we started observing divergence in such a way that the percentage of people that wanted more measures started increasing and increasing and increasing, and now it's reached 67%. And then the percentage of people that say the measures are enough was decreasing in the same, so the same proportion, and now it's actually pretty low. So even before we had a second wave, even before we had so many cases, there was already some kind of a perception in the population that maybe they should be doing more measures, Yeah. So I thought that was quite interesting. Because, on the one hand, the government was sort of declaring victory in quotes, but on the other hand, the citizens were not so sure, and they were actually asking for more measures.
Yeah, so it shows indeed that research into these perceptions, social backgrounds, cultural differences, maybe is very important. Thank you, Nuria.
Absolutely, yeah. Also, we found, and I'm not going to give the details, but we do find significant gender differences as well. We find significant age differences and gender differences. Yeah.
All different components.
There is a question from the chat that I'll try to kind of translate more or less in something like, it's very, very on topic. The AI provides information, the politics should take decisions. This gap, how you can prevent the politics to kind of use the AI results for their own benefit or for their own interpretation of the world that is not necessarily data-driven. And on the other hand, how you can avoid that a blind faith on data and AI can just be wrong, because we know that errors are there. And for instance, the tracing application is not really working, but politics really put their stake on that, and maybe it's not completely right. So how do you see this need for finding the right balance from two words that basically don't speak the same language, but they need to work together?
Yeah, so I think there's several points in the question that are very good points. The first one is, of course, data can be politicized, and it is many times politicized, and it is distorted and selected and chosen to tell whatever political story you want to tell. And that's why I think in the holistic approach that I propose, even though I had to go really quickly in my presentation, there is a big component of having sort of like the 3 Ps, so public, private, people partnerships. I think there is a very a strong role that civil society can play together with the scientific community, which is also civil society, but the experts. I think we need these 3 elements to be involved and to be doing sort of like checks and balances on each other. I do think there is a huge potential to help us make better decisions if we understand what the actual situation is. And a good way to understand what the situation is through the analysis of data. But we need to make sure that we're doing it right. The data is not foolproof. The data could have biases. The data could have been, could be noisy. So that's why you need the experts to really understand what the possibilities are with the data. But also you need the civil organizations involved to precisely to try to prevent the politicization in the use of the data, or to the or sort of like selecting and cherry picking, what data you want to use, which has been happening with the pandemic, by the way, to tell whatever story you want to tell. And I think that is not what the possibility and what the opportunity is. The opportunity is to really have a deep understanding of what the real situation is, to be able to make better decisions and to be able to help, as much as possible. But we cannot be naive about it. And that's why it's so important to have this holistic approach and to have all these different stakeholders being involved and working together, something that I don't think has successfully happened during the pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We will hand over the floor to Paul. Paul, could you please also share your views based on your work and your expertise? I will stop sharing so you can share your screen.
Yes. So thanks a lot for having me here. So I'm presenting the view that is sort of both of mine and represents the large European initiative I'm coordinating, the Humane AI Net initiative, which is currently a project in the ICT48 call, which is the European Union's AI research unit, but actually builds on a long history of work, mostly within the FET unit on, let's say, AI intelligence for societal benefit, back to the Future ICT initiative. So this is the mission statement of the project. It's about shaping the AI revolution in a direction that should be beneficial to humans, obviously AI for the good. But there are 3 things I would like to emphasize in this, which I think are quite fundamental. The first one is that we are not talking about developing AI for the good, but rather shaping the revolution. And I think I will come back to this later. This is quite crucial. We see this unprecedented transformation. I think Nuria already mentioned some of it. It's not about choosing whether to do it or not. It's about shaping it. It's about riding the beast to make sure that it goes where we think it does the most good. The second thing is that while there's a lot of political will and emphasis of making sure that AI is for the societal good, which is important, the fundamental problem is not about political will, but it is about fundamental scientific questions that need to be solved to make sure that AI actually benefits society. And the third thing is that you really need to think about both the benefit for the individual and for the society as a whole, which I think this panel is about, and that is very, very important. So the three things that we feel are critical for systems to learn, and where scientific foundation needs to be developed, is to make sure that AI understands humans. And I put understand in emphasis because machines cannot really understand. They can build models. Systems have to get better in interacting, not just with individuals, but in interacting and understanding how they influence complex social settings and structures. And the main motto of the project is that what we want to achieve, what we're looking at, is building an AI that does not aim to replace humans or replicate human capabilities, but is meant to enhance human capabilities, to help us do and achieve what we would like to, but maybe cannot today. So this is a very important point. And that, of course, has to be done while respecting human autonomy, self-determination, which is often very difficult, because if you talk about enhancing capabilities, you are changing the way a person is doing something. So the border between impacting self-determination and actually helping is very difficult to find. A key insight of the project is that this is an interdisciplinary endeavor. If we want AI for the good in that sense, then we need to do AI research in combination with HCI research, in combination with social science research. And the project combines many different communities. Within AI, we are one of the few projects that combines the Claire and the Alice communities. We have very strong involvement of the HCI community through So Big Data also, and of the big data community, and also of the social science community. The project structure reflects, again, this insight about an interdisciplinary approach. So we say at the core, we have our work packages on societal AI. And in this context, we don't only mean this thing when you look, when you do something in AI, look at the social impact of that specific thing. It's rather about understanding how the fact that everybody is using AI, that AI is everywhere, changes collective processes. So there's a strong involvement of the computational social science people and complexity science people. Then, of course, ethics and responsible AI. Those are sort of the core boundary condition things we look at it. And around that, we have built research in the classical AI areas, learning and reasoning, perception and world modeling, which is sort of at the interface between AI and human-computer interaction, and very, very strongly human-computer interaction as a component. So that was the vision of the project. Now let me mix it with some of my personal views. So first of all, I want to come back to this, and I like the statement by the Commission, essentially saying that it's not that AI can do good or AI can do bad. AI is there as a technology that transforms our society in every respect like no technology before. And the way we approach AI and the way it is integrated in our society will define the world we live in. What is meant by that is that very often you discuss, for example, on jobs and industry, which jobs may actually be rational as a way through AI, how can we change that? It's important, but it's just a small aspect. If you look at it, AI transforms whole industries. AI makes things that were leading worldwide into being non-competitive. Look at the automobile industry. In Germany, it's a big issue, right? You have companies that have built up some technological know-how over decades. And now, because you have AI, and a lot of the know-how with appropriate computing power can be replicated by others. Also, because you have combination of things are AI and, for example, electric mobility, suddenly this becomes non-relevant. Because you just take an electric car, you put a motor on every wheel, you add AI to control it, and you get handling and many properties which took decades to develop in old technology. So it really is about riding the beast. And now comes my personal remark. I think if you want to shape the AI revolution and not to be overrun by it, We must be prepared to embrace it in its fullness, and then we can shape it. And let me tell you what I mean. I really like this slide. So this is something, when cars emerged, people quickly realized that they are going to change the way we live. People realized that they are dangerous. So the first reflex that people had is, let's try to impose restrictions that will ensure that even with cars, nothing will change, right? We had this thing where there was actually people proposing that in front of every car, there should be a person walking with this red flag, you know, warning everyone. And that way, nothing will change in our cities. Well, of course, it didn't work. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that we accepted that we will have cars in our cities roaming as they wish, causing accidents, killing people. On the contrary, we have an extremely complex framework of technical infrastructures, legal norms, social norms that try to make sure that cars don't do harm. And of course, it's an ongoing debate where we have different positions. Some people would like to change mobility entirely. It will change. Some people observe what they should, some don't. And I think when you talk about privacy and AI, this is something that we want to do. What I'm afraid of, that very often we as a community that tries to advocate privacy and AI for the good, take this red flag approach. We try to see, okay, there is this, you know, data emerging every day, AI needing data, but still we want to keep things as they always were. There should be no changes in what data means. There should be no more data, no changes in the concept of privacy. This will not work. We have to make sure that things that we care about, which is human dignity, democracy, equal opportunity, will not change. But the notion of privacy, the amount of data available will change. And either we embrace it and shape it, or if we try to stop it, then it will just overrun us. Talking about data, there's one point where data is the key, right? And you know, that's my favorite slide in my AI lecture, rubbish in, rubbish out. You give your system back data, it produces bad things. Data is actually why AI produces bias. Mostly it's not AI that produces bias. You apply AI to data, which is biased because our society is biased, and it just enhances that bias. It makes it stronger. Also, there's this big movement saying, you know, we should try to limit the amount of data as far as possible. And people often say, you know, AI to work needs good data. So yeah, we give AI a small amount of good data and we don't need to collect more data. Of course, what we want AI to do is to work in open-ended environments. You want cars to be able to
Paul,
drive,
2 minutes.
Yeah, on a street in Rome, as well as on a test track. And, you know, and for that, you can never stop collecting and processing data because the open world cannot be described by the finite amount of data. And then, of course, labels are important. It's not what data you give the system, but how to annotate it. And I think one thing is that we should stop fooling ourselves. There is this trend where people say, you know, computers need good data. So actually, saying that if you have more privacy, then our AI system will be less good and there is a trade-off is not true. No, there is a trade-off. You want privacy, you get less data, your AI system is going to be less good. You want better AI systems, you will have to make compromises on privacy. No free lunch. However, and I think that's important, it doesn't mean, as a lot of people suggest, that if we want to compete in AI, we have to forget privacy. Because you can have adequate privacy and good AI system. You just have to be aware that there is an explicit trade-off, have a social debate on how we address this trade-off, and then you can have both things not being perfect, but being good. And let me finish with a Corona example. I was very heavily involved in some discussions in Germany about the Corona tracing app, where you detect contacts through Bluetooth, and then if you have a contact with somebody who was infected, those who had contact should be informed. And the debate was centered about two approaches. One of them was labeled as the central approach, the other one as a distributed one. That by itself was really interesting because the centralized thing doesn't really reflect the technology behind it. It was a framing that people who didn't want this approach put there as sort of a threat to the public. So the difference in words is that one approach essentially means that you collect anonymized identifiers, and when somebody is infected, the health authorities can see who was in contact with them and incorporate that in their contact tracing procedure. So the doctors and the health authorities love it. Of course, the problem is that if you give people access to personal contact information, then there are a lot of people in politics, which we may not really like, who will also love it. And you can find those people even in Europe. So it's the trade-off. And actually, the app that has now been implemented works in such a way that it's absolutely impossible to decode those identifiers that were collected on who you had contact with. What happens is that if you are infected, those identifiers are sent to everyone, and everybody looks on their phone if this identifier is somebody I've seen, and then warns you. Sounds like the conceptually fantastic system. And actually, I love the concept behind it. The problem is that people now realize, for example, in Germany that adopted that system, that they makes the system totally useless in terms of supporting the contact tracing procedure, because you are infected, you go to your health authorities, they are obliged to do contact tracing. You have your app in your pocket, and this app may or may not have informed people. But of course, the health authorities cannot rely on a may or may not. And although you have the app, they have to do the entire contact process again barefoot, inputting exactly the information that your phone may have on itself into their own computer. So essentially, you did not prevent any data from being collected on the phone, but you did not help the healthcare authorities to do better contact tracing. And in the end, if you do better contact tracing, more efficient, then you can make sure that you don't have to do lockdowns as fast because your contact tracing work, right? So it's a very difficult trade-off. On one hand, yes, conceptually, you don't want authorities to have access to contact information, but in terms of contact tracing, you're collecting this information anyway through healthcare authorities, and all that you achieve is, without doing any data protection in the sense that data is not collected, make the work of the authorities more difficult, and at the same time ensure that this contact tracing process will break down sooner and you will have lockdown soon. So very difficult trade-off. Thank you, that's it.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for, wait, let me share my screen. Thank you for presenting very clearly. My camera is not showing. Okay, I'm back. So thank you for presenting very clearly on the research questions and for sharing your views. I agree very much with the role you present for society actually in shaping the AI revolution. So you mentioned the societal debate or the necessity to have a debate. I was wondering what your views would be on how to make this more concrete. Do you have some experiences on how you could actually stimulate this debate on how society could play the role? Because it's not easy to have, as Nuria already said, to have one voice of society maybe. How could society play a role in this? How could we stimulate this, or how could we shape this to have this debate? Because I agree with you that it's necessary to have indeed this win-win and to have both of them being like to have the protecting of the interest and to have the full innovation potential of the technologies.
So I think for me, and what I try to do, the most important thing is to educate the public about what AI is. So what you see is that in public, you mostly have, and let's say in the large parts of the public, they understand AI from the movies people have seen, right? The biggest worry people have about AI is the singularity thing about AI sort of taking over the world. And of course, if you understand what today's AI is, right? That is essentially, if you look at machine learning, just numerical optimization in highly dimensional spaces, then this is total nonsense, right? You know, and numerical optimization algorithm doesn't wake up and tell, I'm going to take over the world. But people have to understand. So making people understand that AI is essentially not more and not less, that complex mathematical algorithms that can extract useful information from large amounts of data is, I think, the first step. So you take away, so this demystification of AI. And then you have a basis to really discuss where it's good and where it's bad, because you take away the, you know, the fear component. You know, I cannot resist saying, you know, I'm a big Star Wars fan, and there's this beautiful citation from Yoda saying, fear is the path to the dark side, right? When you have people actually being afraid, then you stop being able to have a rational discussion.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Maybe, Stefano, do we have any particular questions? Otherwise,
I think it's better if we try to, if we try to keep going, because we are a bit late. And,
yes, we are.
We can address, the questions are written, so all the panelists have access to who can have a look, and maybe when we do the roundtable, addressing any of them.
Perfect. Yes, then without further ado, we will continue with the contribution of Dr. Clara Neppel. Clara, you have the floor. I will stop sharing my screen.
Andy?
Sorry, Clara, you're muted.
Yes, now I see. I'm sorry, I didn't mute myself now. So, thank you. I hope you can see my screen now, and I have to go back. So thank you. Thank you also for the nice introduction, Natalie, at the beginning. So my name is Clara Neppel. I'm the director of IEEE in Europe. We are based in Vienna. And for those of you who don't know what IEEE is, we are basically the world's largest technical association. We have 400,000 members worldwide, and they are involved in different phases of technology development and use, from research to standardization. Probably a lot of you use now one of our most known standards, the Wi-Fi standard. And I would like to well, not repeat basically what was said by the previous speakers, because I very much agree that autonomous intelligent systems play an increasingly important role in our lives. Now, since the focus is on COVID, I would like to take a step back and say what is the problem actually with the contact tracing applications. Of course, it is also a technical problem, as was just mentioned before. However, we also see that now, with the rising number of infections worldwide, the authorities are struggling, because it is still a time-consuming job. It is surprisingly still based on paper forms and on phone calls. And a lot of countries have launched these applications. And the question is, why are they not effective? So as mentioned, some of them are technical problems, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that for these socio-technical systems to be effective, they need to be adopted. And the adoption is clearly linked to the trust. So we have to see, how can we make these systems trustworthy? And one of the ways to do that happened last year basically is to set up principles. Here is a study from January this year. It seems like a long time ago, which tried to categorize the different AI principles which were set up by the different international organizations, and to come up with some common themes that you can see here, such as privacy, accountability, safety, fairness, and so on. So I think that at this moment, we all agree that these principles are important. However, the question is, are we done with this? And of course, as we see now, this is not the end of the story. First of all, we have always to think, so are these principles enough? And just 2 months after, let's say, this study was published, we saw also the need of maybe some new principles which were not important at that time. And that could be, for instance, here now, the digital resilience, which clearly showed us in the pandemic. AI was very good in predicting certain trends, and also to suggest some drugs and vaccines and so on. However, it had some challenges, for instance, now to predict the speed with which now the second wave is coming, and also to provide this evidence-based policy measures and support for that. And as was mentioned before, of course, a lot of it has to do with the lack of data and noisy data. But a lot of this has also to be done is linked to the fact that the systems are optimized with historical data for the current situation. And I'm a computer scientist myself. I made my PhD in optimizing database systems at that time, long time ago. And I know that our aim was to make the system as performant and as fast as possible. And that is a problem in unexpected situations, because you didn't take into account, let's say, different scenarios, which would make these systems resilient as we would need it now in the pandemic. And this is happening right now, but we see one principle which became very clear, which was not very clear before. So we need to reiterate also our assessment on these principles. Then it was also mentioned that trade-offs are important. And here we have the example of face recognition. So some cases, like the Clearview example, led to some extreme measures, so that face recognitions are banned in a lot of cities right now. And of course, this is again a trade-off for security and efficiency, because face recognition can be very efficient and can be used very well in border control, in security, and so on. So again, the privacy, and coming back actually to the example that was mentioned before, as regards the car industry, if you think of it, at that time, we also had to make a trade-off between principles. We had to give up the absolute freedom of movement, or the speed, for security and safety. So this is also something that we have to think of right now. I think that one of the important questions that are now linked to privacy are maybe the next step. So the first step that we had with the GDPR is on data tracking and collecting of data. But people increasingly see that this is just the first step of a process for building up profiles, for instance. So first of all, the tracking not only tracks our location, contacts, and face, but it can track different things like our voice, DNA, gait, emotions, and so on. And the question is, when these are aggregated with other user data or with sensor data, what kind of profiles are there built up in the different systems, and what kind of implications do they have for us and individuals? And here again, the trade-off is a delicate one, because sometimes, for instance, we might have a red line in predicting the mental health of an individual, but it could be very beneficial to have, let's say, aggregated data to devise health policies. So here again, another question which I think is also important is what happens with these profiles. Are they being reused? Are they being retrained? What kind of data is the basis? What is the accuracy of these profiles? And so I think that these kind of questions are going to be increasingly important. And I think that one of the questions when we set up the panel was to see, why would business care? So why would business care for ethics and for AI for good? And here, for instance, a study which showed us very clearly that if there are serious ethical problems, then first of all, users would stop interacting with a company. But also, as an Economist business unit recently published, I think just a week ago, it showed that by taking into account the values, if you want so, of the stakeholders, it's increasing your value proposition in terms that you have more trusted products, you have more customer engagement, and you also have a better talent acquisition. So I think, and of course, regulation is imminent, so it would be good to prepare already now for these ethical questions and to prepare to make actually all AI for good. So as you mentioned before, Natalie, we are for benefiting, so developing technology for the benefit of humanity. So AI should also be only for the benefit of humanity in the best case. So
Clara, 2 minutes.
Yes, one way. Yes, sure. So one way to do this is, of course, also to work with companies and organizations to see where they are in this journey in the AI ethics and in AI adoption framework, from lagging to leading, where it actually becomes part of the strategy. And what I also think is important is that it's clear that we now become part of an ecosystem. At the beginning, we had standalone AI systems, which is not longer the case. We see this also with the Corona app. If we move from one country to another, we don't know at the moment what kind of data is exchanged between the applications, if they have the same standard as regards data governance. And I think that's the same also for all AI applications. We now have object recognition systems which are used for traffic or for manufacturing, or we have public services which are using speech generation. So we are seeing this dependency, and it is important to now address something which the European Commission coined as an ecosystem of trust. One way to do this, and elements of that, could be standards. So having open and consensus-based processes, not only to define the principles, but also to how to achieve these principles and how to validate this. So we started it in IEEE with developing, beside technical standards, also social technical standards, which take into account, so defining different levels of transparency, taking into account value into the design. But in case of self-learning system, it is also important to take into account that these systems change their behavior and output over time. So we need to have something like accepted behavior, if you want so, and the possibility of independent bodies to have audits on that, or even to have a runtime monitoring in the future. And last but not least, of course, it is important to see the governance of these AI systems, because it is ultimately this decision in the organization, businesses, cities, that will determine which kind of standards and best practices will be used for this AI for good. And probably these three elements, standards, best practices, certification, and governance structures, will be important to set up this ecosystem of trust, which can complement the legal, the development of legal measures that are now also pursued by the European Commission and Council of Europe. Thank you for that. I hope I didn't go too much over my time.
Perfectly on time.
So let me stop here.
Yes, thank you very much, Clara, for that very interesting presentation. There are many elements that I would like to also pick up on. I would maybe like to ask one follow-up question. So you were mentioning that we're taking first steps, but it's a developing understanding on what is the legal and ethical impact of technologies. And that we could actually strengthen this. Do you think that testing and experimentation, and for instance, a combination with regulatory sandboxes, that it is a valuable initiative to actually help all the involved stakeholders to understand the potential impact, and then also to assist the development of standards, and to assist the development of standards of processes, actually to have processes being standardized onto how to deal with this understanding that's not complete and that is continuously developing over time.
Yes, thank you for that question. So I think it is absolutely important. So developing, if you want, so trustworthy AI, it requires a combination of technical, cultural, and organizational skills. So I think in order to develop this AI for good, we need both. We need a top-down approach, which comes from regulation, and we need also the bottom-up approach. Also because there are different timescales, of course. Even for standards, if you think it can take years until standards are developed. So this is clearly not acceptable for AI systems, which can just take some months for being developed. So we need to be innovative in all fields, from regulation as well as standard setting, and also bringing in new actors. So with our initiative Ethically Aligned Design, we brought together our technical community with the different stakeholder groups. So we have ethically aligned design now for business, but also for parents or for healthcare and so on. So bringing together these stakeholders is important to understand the issues and to translate these issues then also into technical requirements. And yes, regulatory sandboxes can be this, and we see this at very different levels. So one level is, of course, the intergovernmental organization. The Council of Europe is, as we well know, is working on regulating AI, maybe especially defining the red lines in justice and so on. But we also see at the city level. So we are doing a proof of concept with the city of Vienna that would like to impose, if you want, so their own standards for their public services. And I think that we will see here more and more coming, because public services is also a special case, but citizens cannot choose another service.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much. You also already mentioned why would businesses care. So that's, I think, a very good segue to the next two presentations. Gabriela, I would like to give the floor to you from a market analyst perspective and to share your views. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Let me open my screen. Okay, I hope you see it. Can you check me? Can you confirm if you see my presentation, Natalie?
No, we can't. We can see you, but not your presentation.
All right. Sorry, let me try again. We did it before, so I need to. Now you should see it.
Yeah, but it's not in presentation mode.
Coming. It's slow. There you go.
No, it's okay.
Finally, we are.
You can start.
So, thank you very much, Natalie, and I've been listening very carefully, and it's a really interesting discussion. I'm from IDC. IDC is a market research company, and I'm bringing here, I want to share with you some of my thoughts from the market perspective. And what I find very interesting, I think there are at least two things which have been said, which I'm going to say again from my perspective. One is the need for building an ecosystem of trust. This is something IDC has now built into its vision of the future enterprise. We have a number of dimensions, and one of them is the dimension of building trust. So an ecosystem of trust is really a key concept. And the other one is about the change in consumers and citizens' mind frame. Anyway, first of all, I think we all agree AI is inevitable, and it's a market taking off. What we foresee as IDC is that worldwide, from 40 billion revenues euros, it will become 3 times as much by 2025. So 119 billion euros of revenues worldwide, even if in 2020 there was a stop, but COVID-19 has not slowed down too much the technology and digital market. So we foresee them to pick up again, and this forecast is dated from August 2020, so it's adjusted for the current recession. I think it's interesting to talk about what is social good, and this was actually one of the questions which was made. From our point of view, social good is not simply a generic or kind of religious concept. It's something very concrete. We can see 3 kind of, if you want, of stakeholders who have to do with social good and employ AI for this. So first of all, organizations who have social good as a primary goal, and that's non-governmental organizations, other non-profit organizations. For example, the UN Pulse Labs, who is looking at data technologies for achieving social good in general. So we are talking about social welfare and improving society in many ways. There is also social good as a complementary goal. If we talk about general public services, and that's government, social services, education, healthcare, their objective is to create public value, and they deliver services and they have efficiency and effectiveness goals, but they also, in building public value, they address social good. And this includes a number of aspects such as improving democracy, transparency, social inclusion, equal access to basic services, the respect of human rights. So we have a very large part of the economy where social good and achieving social good is part of the actual structure of the organizations performing their day-to-day activities. And this is so far, I think, one of the most important aspects. For example, managing the COVID pandemic, that's where we are: healthcare, public good, government, and public services. Then there is social good to improve business, not to be seen so negatively, I mean, but what we see is a very important trend by corporations and companies in general to reinforce their corporate social responsibilities, initiatives, and investments. And the number of initiatives which are willingly undertaken by companies such as Google, for example, who launched a call to provide funds to a number of companies using AI to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And companies like Amazon Web Services, who is the leader of cloud computing services in the world. And you know that Amazon is very much now considered is feared in terms of competition. But Amazon, for example, has launched an initiative to help its customers to manage the environmental impacts and carbon impacts of their cloud activities by sharing data and also using AI as well as other digital technologies. And I must say that environmental good and goals is one of the most important dimensions that we see in terms of improving, using AI, leveraging AI and data to preserve, to protect the environment is definitely a very important trend. And there is a prediction by IDC actually that we see this trend of aiming at taking into account the ethical dimension, as mentioned more than once in this discussion. We believe that by the end of 2022, 80% of corporations will develop or modify social responsibility statements and enable their customers in finding and promoting social causes. So you see there is a change in this. It's not only corporate social investments is not seen anymore simply as something to make the company look good. Of course, there is a reputational return, but there is also a much stronger relational aspect on interacting with customers. And we see this also from other aspects. This is an US survey, but we believe it's valid also. The trend exists in Europe as well. We see that consumers are increasingly rewarding companies who invest in sustainability programs. And the fact that a brand has a sustainability program has a large or very large impact on their decision. And as you can see, this is something which is stronger in the age groups, the younger age groups. So it's something over 65 is less considered, but under 65 is really important. What do we mean by sustainability? We mean companies who, for example, commit to environmental sustainability, to ethical sourcing of materials, to fair wages for employees, who have employee diversity and inclusion programs, support social and or community causes, and employ volunteering programs. So if you can see, there is a very large range of activities which are now getting into the agenda of many corporations. And of course, this is part of what they call the brand trustworthiness. And as you can see, we have found again in this survey, the main 4 criteria by which consumer reward the companies and trust leading brands, which have to do with not only fair wages, but also meeting consumers' needs and make it right when something goes wrong and protect consumer privacy. I think it's very important also to mention again environmental sustainability. I realize this is not only AI, but this is part of how you frame the AI and ethics discussion, because I know that there are a number of, especially researchers in Europe, who are worried that if we, in Europe, we create too many, let's say, ethical regulation, it can constrain AI development and services. But what I want to point out that in general, this need to build an ecosystem of trust is becoming a priority for many companies. And you can see that ethics and social responsibility and privacy are very much part of this list of values that companies are more and more looking to build, to have their customers trust them. Because we are in a mature market and you need to preserve your customers. And
Gabriela, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm almost done. We have another prediction which says that by 2025, 90% of global 2000 companies, so the world companies, will mandate reusable material, hardware supply chains, carbon neutrality targets for providers, and lower energy use. Again, this is social good in an environmental sense. Just a few words, but I think this was already covered. If we look more closely instead of the role of AI for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is really one of the most important ways in which AI is being used for social good, there are some very original ideas leveraging the power of data. And there are a few examples here, and which are taken from Google challenges for AI for social good, but also other initiatives. The two on the top, hunger prevention and remote healthcare, have to do with smartphone apps which are used in order to help separately farmers and doctors to perform better diagnosis and to actually use precision agriculture in remote areas. But I think what I find particularly interesting is how some of these NGOs pioneer ways of using AI, which is not so common. For example, in the case of this skill lab, the focus is on reduced inequalities. What they do is to, they use AI in order to help immigrants to to build their CVs and transfer their skills into the welcoming countries, in the hosting countries, labor market system, in order to find jobs for them. So it's a way to use AI in order to adapt what immigrants know and have to do and their skills, and present them in such a way that they can be accepted by the new country where they have moved. And the other initiative is by Huridogs, and it's a company which is based in Switzerland, which is using AI like big legal lawyer studies are doing. This is for human rights lawyers to help them to automatize some of the initial requirements and looking at the kind of documents and requirements you need in the justice process so that they can defend human rights better. And this is very important because it shows that a way of AI, which is pioneered by big, millionaire lawyer firms, can be also applied to the nonprofit sector. This is very nice, but I don't think there is much time to talk about it. I put it in because it's an example which I find really attractive. It's POSE. It's a system to help managing the wildlife preserves in Africa and other countries. It's an AI system to predict poaching risks and to help the rangers to find the poachers. And this is going to be integrated into a spatial system, SMART, used by the Wildlife Conservation Society and World Wildlife Fund, with potential impact on more than 800 protected areas in more than 60 countries. This is really the use of data in a creative way to help, for example, protect wildlife and the environment. And this is all. I mean, I think it's very important to see how both from the private market and the NGO and the third sector, there are so many good ideas and initiatives coming up, and it's much broader than focusing only on, for example, privacy or protecting human rights. Specifically, AI is being used for social good more and more, and I think it's very important that we help to this kind of trend. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Sorry for bringing this very valuable perspective to the discussion. And for also helping Stefano and myself for timekeeping and for already tackling in your presentation a question that was raised by the audience on defining and scoping of social good. So that's excellent, Gabriela. Thank you for that as well.
Very efficient.
Yes, absolutely. We hope we still have a few minutes, but in sake of timekeeping, we will immediately switch now to the presentation of Gash. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd just quickly like to introduce myself. I'm Gash Buller from the European Factory Foundation. I'm involved with quite a number of European projects. I've been in the European research field for quite a number of years, but sometimes I feel I'm almost like an imposter because I come in and I start to, almost like a virus, start to shake people up a little bit, because all the presentations we've heard so far are excellent, and they cover all the areas that we expect them to cover. But what I'd like to sort of do is almost give a high level view, an engineering view of some of the aspects that we've sort of heard about. So if I can sort of quickly start off with the initial concerns, and this is almost like a summary of some of the things that we've already covered. One of the things is it's always difficult to understand the context of AI, because AI has been used so broadly, whether it's in the context of embedded systems or shop floor implementation or office or law applications. It's really easy to confuse the general public. And one of the big things to me is not necessarily the misuse, and we're talking about AI for good. You know, we really now need to understand that AI starts to incorporate a whole new area of psychology, of philosophy, and it's increasingly been deployed in a wide range of areas. And we've already talked about this line of ethics and bias and reality. And all of a sudden, things are becoming extremely blurred. And I'm not going to get political in all of these things. And we see all these things in real life. In fact, I'm not saying that the community app is, has got an AI system on it, but I've managed to get to number 2 after the chairman of the community, and I'm a relatively newcomer. So we've got to be careful. We unleash these fantastic tools and we think they're all going to be there for the good, but there's plenty of people that are going to abuse the systems, and we just need to be mindful of that abuse. Some of the other things, again, I mean, I've heard and some of the sort of points that Paul made. I mean, it's all good stuff. I'm not trying to be too controversial, but we're forever trying to make AI systems human. At the end of the day, we're writing algorithms for human-related systems using logic chipsets. At the end of the day, machines are here to serve humans until we become machines, and that's a whole new topic just there. When we bring it a little bit closer to applications, when we look at shop floor systems, certainly the area that I'm from control systems, there's a massive change in hardware, firmware, middleware. And what we're starting to do now is we're starting to inject code straight into some of these systems. The difficulty is that we're making it harder and harder for us to know and understand what is going on within these systems. And it's really important, and certainly me as an engineer, it's important to keep these audit trails going. Otherwise, how are you ever going to find problems? And we're getting to the point where humans are almost unable to respond to machine malfunctions. And again, that's almost like the sort of the myth that we hear from all of these sci-fi movies. And going back to data, and of course, data is, of course, the heart of everything that's happened for a long time. We've got the giants, the Apples, the Tatas, the Googles, and everybody else, the Amazons. They've all for years been creating their own clouds of data. But what we've got to remember is that all of these clouds of data are constantly evolving. We're starting to bring in new technologies. but we're still leaving an awful lot of legacy systems behind. There's an awful lot of legacy chipsets. And at the end of the day, we're always going to be held to ransom with our past. And we're really opening ourselves up to the cyber breach if we think we're just now moving on to technologies. At the end of the day, we've always got to think about what we're leaving open in our legacy systems. And of course, all these mini clouds, I mean, the ultimate aim is sometime, somewhere, someone wants to control this total knowledge of the human race. Again, it sort of sounds very futuristic, but really this is where we're heading. At the end of the day, we're relying on such massive systems that we as humans can't deal with them. And we've got to rely on these AI systems to do these tasks for us. So will the machine surpass our human creators as predicted, you know, in some of these movies again? So it's not about scaremongering. This is where we're heading. This is ultimately what everybody is trying to do. And it's all about power and control. So again, taking that focus from a historical point of view, yes, we talk about data collection, and we forever are just absolutely churning tons of data. But me as an engineer would say, well, what do you want this data for? We've got to be really clear about how we focus the data that we need and make it dynamic in certain cases and static in some cases, but bearing in mind that whatever data we produce, how do we keep tabs of it? So we're always looking at making things bigger and better, but at the end of the day, one of the things you've always got to remember is what happens when things fail. It's all about failure, unfortunately. So it's not all about getting the best of things. And this is really where I feel the explainable AI, I mean, we saw it in some of the opening speeches yesterday, is really important, because we've got to keep creating these audit trails. We've got to keep checking where these systems are taking us. So another thing is, you know, from the data models, you know, we're forever changing data formats. I mean, all of us know that not that long ago, we were all listening to CDs, watching DVD films, and all of a sudden, within a decade, all of that has just basically become worthless because we've now got streaming services, still producing data, but in a completely different format. And it's not going to be long before we then look at the next level again. So, you know, what we're doing is we're generating masses and masses of this data. Well, where is this being stored? Well, we used to store it locally. We used to store it on our hard drives and our systems. Well, of course, we've got cloud services now. So it's getting further and further away from the source. It's going into these untouchable locations. So, you know, we've already talked about trust. How do we trust these organizations that are storing our data? How do we trust that they're going to use it for our good? I mean, all researchers always think of it as, oh, well, we're going to really create a great world. But the reality is that it's that same information gets landed into other people's hands as well. So whose benefit are we really storing this data for? And of course, in terms of the business models, you know, we aren't really considering, we're talking about it, but we're not really considering all the social, ethical, political, religious impacts of some of the things that we're doing. And what we mustn't forget is greed is stronger than ever. And it's all about who has the power. It's not about fantastic systems. It's not about educating everybody to be nice. At the end of the day, we need to understand what our society is built up of. And that's what we just need to be mindful of. And when we consider the human factors, you know, yes, you know, it's all good. You know, we want to introduce these fantastic systems, but are we actually chaining people to the systems, or are we actually giving them power? Are we actually giving them systems that are really going to help them in their daily lives and their work situations? So it's all about benefiting the individual. And if you can make the technology benefit the individuals, then that's where you get your adoptions. And lastly, what we want to do is almost think about where all of this is going. I mean,
discussion.
Sure, we're getting into this death spiral almost, and I'm not trying to be pessimistic about it, but you've got to be careful where we're letting these algorithms lead us. Yeah, keep our human logic as long as we can. And that's really the sort of points that I'd like to make, and that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gash, for giving us all this food for thought. So I would like to, I don't know, maybe I need to check in with Stefano to see whether we can go a few minutes over time. I know that the account is being used on different sessions. So can we go like 5 minutes over time?
I think let's go if we can. If
okay,
we
yes.
are going
maybe
to
like
be cut off.
One very short follow-up question, Gash, maybe is to see like what is your view on how we could encourage or incentivize businesses more to actually take on this impact? So you say that they're not at this point, but can we encourage or incentivize? Are there strategies?
I think from a business perspective, it's always going to be a number of things. It's how do you increase profits? How do you get people to make things simpler, quicker, cheaper? And all of this technology, you know, the sort of steps of technology that we've been going through, you know, the industry 1, 2, 3, and 4, and now AI. These are really just tools at the end of the day at our discretion. Sometimes we see them more than tools. So if we can really just understand how these tools are going to be used and adopted, it really makes the adoption of the tools much easier. So obviously Apple have got it right with their Apple iPhones, keep it nice and simple. So behind simplicity is complexity, of course. So the more simpler you can make a complex system, the easier it's going to be. But taking on some of the points that we raised in some of the other presentations, the technology behind is phenomenal, but we just need to understand how and who uses that technology.
Thank you very much. I would like to maybe give the word to the other panelists. Now hearing all the contributions, all the questions, all the presentations, do other panelists want to have a very short key takeaway that they would like to share?
I can say really quickly one word. Gash, you mentioned greed as a motivator. I don't really like that word because it is very strong moral undertone, which is, I mean, of course, greed exists, but I do think we should talk about incentives, because we know that, as I showed in my presentation, if people become more sensitive and share certain goals, then companies will go with them, and people in companies are the same as people outside companies. So, for example, environmental and sustainability sensitiveness is much greater today in the younger generation than it was before. It's definitely something which was not on any radar before. And this is, I think, important. So I believe this is part of framing. We need to frame the whole AI technology development in some general goals so that there are incentives to behave better. But we need to leave initiatives, because otherwise you cannot have innovation.
I purposely use that word greed because at the end of the day, like I said, you know, we all want a better world. We all want AI for good. That's why we're having this conversation. But we also need to understand the world. So as much as we can try to shape it and make it into the world that we want, how many times has good technology been put into the wrong hands? Yeah, so it's that we need to be mindful of it. So by all means, let's try to create a better world. Let's try to create the right technologies and incentivize people, but be aware that behind all of that, there are still these other forces.
Thank you. Clara or Paul?
Yes, so yeah, I would just like to agree with Gash how important it is to document, of course. And I just want to also highlight that, of course, there's also this tension that we discussed about also inside organizations, because documentation will require also some delays in maybe delivering the product, and which is in contradiction with the agile development project management cycle. So there are a lot of tensions, I think, in a society, but also inside the organizations. And when I was talking about social technical systems, I think what will be important in order to improve this trust is to involve already in the design of the systems the the stakeholders, and not only the immediate stakeholders, but also stakeholders who might be indirectly affected by the system. I can give you one example from Vienna, from where we are based, where the government devised a system, an AI-based system, basically, which was very transparent. It was not on neural networks, to devise some support for people who are unemployed, and they are categorized. They categorize the systems according to their location and previous experience and so on. However, they had to stop this system because it was not only the users who thought that this is inappropriate, but also the whole society, because they thought, what would this mean for neighborhoods and so on. And I think that, of course, this is a challenge, because we will need to embrace in our design teams and our development teams also these stakeholders. We need to also find ways how to engage them. But I think it will be absolutely necessary to do that.
Yes, thank you, Clara. Paul?
For me, what I really enjoyed about this session is that obviously we share the same vision on an abstract level of AI that should be something for the good. But it was already to be seen how we all have very, very different, let's say, nuances of looking at it. And I think that's one of the most important messages, that this thing that sounds so simple, we want AI for the good, is hugely complex. And also, I think what we should have as a message that we honestly give to the public is that it's not a black and white thing, it's shades of gray. We'll never have AI system that only do good. Any system that good has a cost. And in some cases, it will do less good. And I think AI for the good then means systems that do more good than bad. And the most important thing for me is system where the benefits and the costs are transparent to the society, and where we, in a transparent, informed, rational social debate, agreed that we all want those trade-offs, that we are willing to pay the price that the bad things involve to get the good things. And I think if we can achieve that and move the AI in a direction where we're doing those things on which we all agree that we want the good thing, we are willing to pay the price, because that is make our society move in the direction we want to go, then that is what we want.
And just adding to that, Paul, I mean, I totally agree, but it's one thing us all wanting this, but at the end of the day, it's the world that we live in. It's this powerhouse. It's all about money. It's all about power. So how do we get those messages forward when there's an awful lot of suppression that's going out there to still quieten those voices, because it doesn't serve, certain groups of society.
Yes, thank you.
I believe in science, but I really believe that educating the public, making things transparent, making things understandable, right? There's no magic. It's all science. It's all controllable. I think that is really what needs to be done.
Thank you very much, all, and thank you also for giving this perfect ending to what I see, and I agree with Paul, was a perfect panel. There was a multidisciplinary approach, different, very nuanced visions, and yet still a common goal, a common aim that we set to achieve. And let's hope that we can continue this discussion and continue the work on this, continue it within the WUVA or within EBDVF, because so we have in the track 4 on the new society, we have other sessions this afternoon and tomorrow. So it would be nice maybe if we could join or contribute there as well, and also for the audience. I would like to very much thank, I'm sorry, there seems to be a problem with my video. I cannot switch it back on, so I cannot see you, which is unfortunate. I cannot, maybe Stefano, you could in the meanwhile try to fix this, because it says that the host is blocking me to share my video. But I would like to, on behalf of Stefano and myself, thank you all very much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you as well to the organizing committee of this EBDVF track 4, where we've had the discussions in preparing this panel, and acknowledgements also go to the sponsors of the EBDVF event. I'm showing the slide right now. Thank you very much again. Thank you very much to the audience for your contribution and your questions. Let's continue the discussion, hopefully also already this afternoon and otherwise in the near future. Take care all, and thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, and thanks for joining.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop now.
Okay.